Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Sean. I'm the Nerd Doctor here to diagnose what's wrong with your RPG game and here to help you fix it. So first off, I hope everyone had great holidays. I'm sorry I took a few weeks off. If you are, following me and have subscribed to the channel, then I appreciate your patience on me getting out with my third video. I've got the next 3 scripts written. I'm super excited to come out more content. So if you are interested in more, just make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons to allow me to keep coming out with the material you love, and comment if you have any more ideas or stuff that you're interested in hearing when it comes to ICRPG. So the title of this video is a little misleading when I say that I'm talking about ICRPG as a plugin. Now, if you're an experienced player or DM and you haven't watched my ICRPG is better than D&D video, then pause this and go watch it, because I talk about all the mechanics of ICRPG that I prefer there and more. In this video, I will briefly recover some of them, and they are in the Master Edition if you are interested in them. But what I really want to talk about today is which mechanics from systems like D&D that I like to use with ICRPG. As I've mentioned, ICRPG is a very simple system. So if you are a veteran and there are certain mechanics you are used to that you won't see in ICRPG, and that I think are really fun to have. Now, if you're a new RPG player and you haven't watched my How to Play ICRPG game video, then go ahead and watch that one first, and then check out this one for some additional stuff to add in. So let's start off with the ICRPG mechanics as a plugin for your current game real quick. Number 1 is clean stats. In D&D, you have 6 abilities and then a bunch of skills that are difficult to always remember, making your dice rolls a little slower. I think it's useful as a DM to know those skills because it makes it easier for you to know which of those 6 abilities you want to call on for a roll in ICRPG. But the ICRPG system just uses those 6, and which ones you want to specialize in makes things easier for player to learn and start the game. I know there are people who want to be a jack of all trades and be good at all 6, but that's just not realistic. And the whole point of an adventuring party is to have characters that complement each other's differences and specialities, so you have that variety and interesting aspects of the game. Number 2 is effort. By adding a damage-like mechanic to non-combat roles like picking locks or persuading or intimidating a non-playable character, you spotlight the fun of solving or completing a task in stages rather than an all-or-nothing role, making a player's use of time more important and the success feel more triumphant. Needless to say, you don't need to do that every time, but to keep things interesting and implementing that when it's most climactic can be really fun. Number 3, single target numbers. Having a room DC with a single target number makes a DC's prep time shorter and opens up more memory space when getting ready for a session. Though not realistic, letting characters know what the DC of a room is can make rolling more exciting, as well as subtly communicating the difficulty of that room, which can really place tension into an encounter with very little effort from the DM. I will say, though, that this can be difficult mechanic to implement in a game like D&D when you get to higher levels, because when scaling happens and scaling gets really high, and players rarely roll below a 15. Using ICRPG's lower HP and ability system in conjunction with this can be very beneficial. It also makes it so much easier for the DM to calculate percentages. For example, on a straight D20 roll, you have a 5% chance of rolling any single number. So a 50% chance of rolling a 10 or higher. And for every +1 modifier you have an ability, you can increase that percentage of rolling by 5%. Understanding this makes it so much easier for a DM to plan a session. And after all, failure adds as much, if not more, to a story than succeeding. Number 4, the heart system. I mentioned keeping HPs low, but what I'm talking about here is just keeping HPs to a nice round number. As Hankerin, the creator of ICRPG, tells it, he found very little difference in monsters who had 12 HP versus ones that had 16. So why give them these arbitrary numbers? Just give them HP in increments of 10 to simplify your character leveling and the DM's monster creation. And if you're looking for easy ways to have really easy kill minions, then just 1 HP is more than enough, because let's face it, even if you gave them 5 and a player rolls a 1 with an attack effort of +4, then that character is going down. Number 5, chess. As Hankerin says, it may not be realistic to always discover loot in chess, but it's a lot of fun to grant players treasures as rewards to open when they like. There's just something great about it as a way to symbolize you make a treasure roll. They can be put in game with no effect on play mechanics. Number 6, far, near, close. I know there's a lot of players who need to know exactly how far they are from something, how far they can move, and find it difficult to imagine things in this abstract way, but it truly does simplify and shorten things in combat to think in those terms. Professor Dungeon Master in Dungeon Craft gives an excellent example of how this works when he talks about his ultimate dungeon terrain. So if you want more info, check that out. I personally like grids and terrain. It's just easier for both myself and players to visualize, but that's just me. Number 7, mastery. In ICRPG, you have a mastery table that you'll find and to bubble in every time you roll a natural 20. And once you roll 20 of them, you receive a mastery skill. And you can do this up to 3 times in a campaign. I like these kind of random rewards, but that doesn't actually apply equally to everyone. Seeing others progress faster than you, I think, adds a little competition to the adventuring party and can make some really fun role-playing opportunities. Now, for mechanics, I'd like to plug into my ICRPG game. Number 1, conditions. I think D&D's 5e Player's Handbook, or at least the Dungeon Master Guide, are beneficial to own just for things like this. ICRPG doesn't have any examples of conditions, but in a low HP system like ICRPG, having abilities as a character or a monster that can cause certain conditions makes combat so much more interesting. The Dungeon Coach has a great condition to add called the bleeding condition. Martial classes often get the short end of the stick when it comes to versatility. So having abilities that can cause conditions like bleeding or knocking the target prone or being able to cause damage while grappling can give them some interesting tactics, creating advantages for the party. No one likes to feel like the character who can't do as much as the other characters in the party. If they specialize in just fighting, then let them go crazy with it. Let them blind a monster by poking them in the eye or deafen them by discombobulating the target with the clap of the ears like Robert Downey Jr. in Sherlock Holmes. Number 2, exhaustion. I know this is technically a condition, but it is a very underused mechanic in my opinion. I also refer to the Dungeon Coach for one of his simplified homebrew versions of exhaustion, which could be for every level of exhaustion, you take -1 to all rolls and lose 5 feet of movement. Though instead of instant death at level 6, I would have the character just make a dying roll and they'll die in that many rounds if nothing is done. I made a spell that actually helps reverse levels of exhaustion called Invigorate, and it can also minimally heal so that it's a little bit more versatile. But I think that if you use them more, it can just really add something to what's going on in the story. Number 3, spell crit tables. Personally, I love for crits to just feel amazing. Some people just double the dice, and in ICRPG, you just roll a d12 in addition to your effort roll. But what happens when both of those dice you roll a 1? That feels super lame. Or on the opposite side, you can't decide on how bad a nat 1 will go. I found some good ones out there that work really well with D&E, but I'm working on making my own that fits well with ICRPG, which when I finish, if I get enough likes on here, I'll definitely make sure to add it into the description of this video so that you guys can use that as a resource. I do like Professor Dungeon Master's crit fails table from his game Deathbringer, which you can find on his Patreon. Number 4, training. I think training is a very underused downtime activity. In Xanthar's Guide to Everything, they talk about training for things like tool proficiencies, learning languages, or even learning maneuvers in combat. I don't think there's any harm in players getting additional languages or tool proficiencies. And if they spend enough time on their downtime to learn maneuvers, that could be a really nice reward. The trick to having the right standard of how much time it will take to learn how to do these things, per allotment of each one, and then keeping track of it. This is particularly fun to use in ICRPG because of its turn-based system where your turn can be set a number of hours or days that the DM gives you. It also gives you the feeling of working towards something and the enjoyment of achieving it when you're devoted so many turns to it. Number 5 is flaws. I first saw this in an RPG called Cogent, but I've heard it talked about before since In ICRPG, you only get a certain number of ability points to use when making your character. I think it's a great plugin to have a flaw system or a disabling characteristic. Either roll on a table or choose one that decreases one of your abilities or has some sort of active negative consequence. Choosing one would give you an additional +1 for your ability points. For example, maybe you're a spellcaster and you take the feeble flaw, and that gets you a -1 to your strength, giving you one additional ability point to add elsewhere. Or if you've seen Critical Role and recall that the wizard Caleb had psychological trauma, and whenever he cast a fire spell, he had to roll a charisma save or go into shock for a certain number of rounds. Flaws could be excellent roleplay opportunities. As I mentioned, characters aren't meant to be a jack of all trades. Watch any anime or superhero, every one of the main characters has some sort of weakness, except maybe Saitama from One Punch Man. ICRPG has weaknesses in its superhero section, but I think having a flaw table for players to use across all of them can offer some great dynamics to the game. Maybe even base their personal character story, or at least an element of it, to them overcoming this weakness or flaw. Number 6, I'm going to stop at 5 since 6 would have been movement. And I already mentioned that some people just prefer grids and having a certain amount of movement. So, that would been my 6th one, is just, creating a grid system, but I already talked about it above as a alternate plugin. So that's all the ideas I have for today. I hope you enjoyed the material. And if you did, again, hit those like and subscribe buttons and leave a comment if there's anything you want to hear me talk more about in the future. Once again, I'm Dr. Sean, and I'm the Nerd Doctor, here to diagnose what's wrong with your RPG game and here to help you fix it. Thank you.